This is a production breakdown of the fourth song on my EP, which is called Freed. So I'm gonna again go through each track, talk about what I did and the sound design and everything. So I'm gonna start with the vocal chain. For the recording of the vocals I used a Warm Audio 47 and a Scarlett, like with everything else on my EP. And I used the same vocalist again, and I had a vocal melody written in here on the piano roll, but I deleted it before this video. But it basically just uses long notes that fit in the key, which is A flat major. For the lyric writing I kept it pretty simple, and I chose the themes that I chose because this is quite an upbeat song, and I like songs that sound quite upbeat but the lyrics are kind of more bleak, so I decided to go for a song like that. Onto the mixing, remove everything from that and I'll show you the raw take. So first thing I did was some pitch correction just to make sure everything was completely on key. Used the tolerance at 11 cents and the response at 122 milliseconds because I still wanted it to sound quite natural. Next thing I added was a channel EQ where I just cut off the low end that wasn't needed and boosted the high end slightly, since the take was quite kind of mid-heavy. Next thing I did was added a compressor. The threshold was at minus 29 decibels since there were some very quiet parts of the vocal. I wanted it to all be the same level. Did a 30 to 0 to 1 ratio to kind of emulate the sound of putting all the ratio buttons in on an 1176 for that like very compressed sound. Then I didn't add any makeup gain to avoid too much distortion. Also used a limiter at 0.6 decibels because there was a very loud part of the vocals over here that I didn't want to be louder than the rest of the song. I also added some soft distortion, and with that compression it sounds like this. Your name engraved on my... And then over here is the loud part. I'm free. And then the next thing I did was I added a graphic EQ, which I chose to use just because it adds some nice warmth to it. And on this I completely got rid of kind of the sub bass. I did a slight cut here, cut the mid slightly since it was sounding quite boxy, and also boosted 4K for some clarity and also 32K just to give it some air. Then next thing I did was a de-esser, since there was some sibilance around 5.5K. On my tombstone. And next thing was Valhalla Vintage Verb with the SP Amazing Vocal preset with the mix at 36.7, and that sounds like this. And next thing for some presence I used Fresh Air with the mid gain at 25 and the high air at 38, which sounds like this. Then next I have this lead sound, which sounds like this. So this is the sound I made for that. Uses the analog BD sine wave and also this basic shape. Unison's at 16 on this one and 1 at this one. The wavetable positions at 52 on this one and 2 on this one. As you can see, there's a slight filter here just to get rid of the very high end. And there's also AC hum noise, because it kind of gives it sort of analog sound to have a tiny bit of hiss in the background. Also used a compressor on this to kind of bring forward some of those harmonics that are in there. There's also a hall reverb on here with the size at 35, decay of 4.7, low cut at 0, high cut at 63, spin at 25, spin depth at 20%, and the mix at 40. And that's that sound. For mixing, I used Space Designer on it to give it some reverb, in which I used an impulse response with the wet at minus 5.4 decibels, and that reverb sounds like this. And then just to kind of put it in the background, I used a filter with the cutoff at 66%. And EQ, all I did was remove the low end that wasn't needed. And then altogether that sounds like this. And then next up is this MIDI guitar, which sounds like this. This is the Textural Electric Logic preset. And all I did for that was I also used the same impulse response as the lead. Used fresh air on it with the higher at 20% to make it cut through. And EQ, all I did was remove low end that wasn't needed, boosted the mids slightly for some warmth, boosted 4K for some clarity, and also the high end. Just like this. Then this sound on the intro is virtually the same, except I used a tape cassette emulator called Tape Cassette 2 with these settings to make it sound more kind of lo-fi. Also boosted the mids by a lot to give it that kind of warm lo-fi sound. I also filtered it with the cutoff at 54%, and then just bracketed, and then altogether that sounds like this. Then this distorted guitar is from Odin 3. Used Chroma Verb on this with the default preset with the wet at 55%. Also used fresh air with the high air at 30% to make it cut through more. I also cut the low end, boosted the high end and the mids to give it some warmth like the other one. Then also add this distorted guitar, the wet at 22% on this one. So I layered those together with the original guitar. Then onto this synth sound. I use this kind of warped sine wave with the octave, 1 octave up, and also detuned it very slightly. And I also automated the wavetable position, sync and pan, which you can see over here. I also automated this filter to make it kind of sweep. I also use this envelope to kind of make it fade out with each note. And then effects on this. I cut 116 Hz slightly to remove some muddiness. And this is the filter which was automated. I did a chorus to give it some more kind of detune at 0.08 Hz. Delay at 5 milliseconds, no second delay. Depth at 26, feed at 10%. Filter at 6.6K and the mix at 50%. Then I also used this reverb on it, size at 35, decay 4.7, no low cut, high cut 35%, spin at 25%, spin depth at 20, mix at 22. Then without any effects on it, sounds like this. I filtered it to stop it cutting through so much. The cutoff at 62%. And I also used Space Designer with the same impulse response I used. And that sounds like this. And then since it was sitting in the mix properly from the EQ on Serum and the filter, I didn't add any more EQ to it. On to the next sound, which is the chords. This is a pad sound from Preset Share. No, never mind, it's from pluginguru.com. It's this kind of phasing pad sound. Used Valhalla Future Verb on this with the mix at 100%, just because I wanted it to be very washed out. Cut-offs at 79% on this filter to stop it cutting through so much. And then also just did some bracketing on that. Then onto this sound which I made for the verse. Sounds like this. It has this kind of gradual envelope and some noise, which is AC Hum 1 with the level at 44% to give it that kind of hiss sound. Use a sine wave and a saw wave, both with very high unison. And there's tube distortion on here with the drive at 69%, the mix at 100. A flanger with the rate at 0.08 Hz, depth at 100, feed at 50, phase at 180, also with the mix at 100. And there's also a reverb on here with the mix at 100%. Then EQ, all I did was cut the low end and boost the high end to bring out those kind of harmonics you can hear in it. And also fresh air at 88% for the same reason. Then this drone sound, which I used basically across the whole EP. It's just these kind of moving the wavetable on these two sine waves and automating a filter. Then the next sound was a 303 bass on the verse, which sounds like this. All I did for this was a sine wave an octave down, very short envelope to give it a pluck sound, and also a filter with some resonance to give it the sound I wanted, and then distortion to drop it at 95% and the mix at 100%. And then this bass sound. This is the one I normally use. I've talked about it in the other production breakdowns. And there's also this one, which is basically just a pure sub bass. Uses this scream wavetable with the octave at -2, unison at 2, and this moving filter. It also has distortion with drive at 68 and the wet at 100. EQ with a cut at 200 Hz to get rid of muddiness. Filter with the cutoff at 1.3K, the mix at 100%. And this is automated. To give it that kind of phasing sound. There's also a compressor on here to kind of stop it from being so dynamic. Threshold at -18.1, ratio at 3:1, attack at 90.1, release at 90, gain at 4.8, and mix at 100%. There's also a slight reverb on here with the wet at 35%. Then I use this Logic preset called Dance Swirls for the real bass sound. All I did for that was console EQ. To boost the mid gain and add some drive to it. Also added a phaser to it for that kind of post-punk bass tone. With the preset 12-stage phaser. Also used an EQ to cut the low end and boost it 100 Hz. Just because I didn't want it to get muddy and overcrowd the other basses. I boosted the mids, boosted the high end slightly to make it cut through above the other basses. So I'll layer that with the synth bass, it sounds like this. As you can see, they don't overcrowd each other. Then this is the same preset. Except I didn't use the EQ to boost the high end since there was already a lot of high end going on in this part. Then I used this 808 to kind of give this section some more punch. And it's just a sine wave with this LFO for some impact. And then this automated filter again to increase the impact and give it more punch. Used hyper with the rate at 40%, detune at 25, unison at 4, and mix at 50. Used an EQ. No, I didn't. Used a compressor to give it that punch. Threshold at -18.1, ratio at 4:1. Attack at 90.1, release at 591, gain at 2.8, mix at 100%, And as you can see on this visualizer, it's compressing it quite a lot. Just to kind of make it hit harder. Then this drum kit was a Logic session player because I wanted a very natural drum sound to layer with the break beats. The Neo Soul preset. Into this I did a compressor, used the vintage VCA. As you can see, it's compressing quite a lot. Used the K Solid State drum bus preset. And then EQ, all I did was cut the low end. I'll lay this with the break beats. Then this drum kit was made of one-shots, which I found online. Then used a compressor on it just to give it some punch. The threshold at -9, since it's a pretty loud drum part, didn't want it to be too compressed. Ratio at 4:1, makeup gain at 3 decibels, knee at 1, attack at 5.5 milliseconds, and a release at 110. And this is quite a natural compression, because I found that since the drum part was so loud, any more compression than that was just a bit too much. Then these break beats, I'll show you how I mix those. So this is breakbeat 1. What I did to that was use the classic VCA with the threshold at -41.5, since I wanted it to compress at the quietest parts of the breakbeats as well. The ratio at 1:6:1, and the makeup gain at 14 decibels, and distortion at clip to kind of give it some crunch. Also used Space Designer with an impulse response with the wet at -26. And then also some EQ to boost the low end slightly, boost the mids and boost the highs. And that's layered with this breakbeat, which just has a reverb on it, and I didn't EQ it since it already fit in the mix I wanted it to. Used the default preset on here with the wet at 35%. And then these sound effects I found on YouTube, I think. These are just kind of tape machine sounds. And then these kind of click sounds. So that's everything in this song.